Thank you very much, Andres, for inviting me. Fascinating presentations. So what I will be presenting today actually was very recently published as a chapter in a book that I co-edited with my colleague Kian Go and Vinit Mukherjee, and we had Larry Vale very kindly giving a wonderful foreword. It is called Visiting the Urban Ground Floor Through the Eyes of Inner City Older Adults. And I have to say that throughout my career, I have been very interested on issues of public space. I've studied sidewalks and streets and alleys and bus stops and plazas and parks. But I was particularly interested on vulnerable populations and how they are using and they want to be using these public spaces. So I have looked into children and women and low-income folks, ethnic and racial minorities, disabled people. And more recently, maybe because I'm aging myself, I decided to also look into older adults. And as far as the subtitle goes, I think you will understand it once you hear my presentation. I'm very glad that Peter, in his presentation, brought up Lefebvre and the right to the city. I view walking as a human right, and it very much relates to physical mobility, which is the ability to move from one place to another smoothly, quickly, and without any challenges. It also relates to accessibility, which is the ability to access and take advantages of the amenities that exist in urban or suburban environments, the park, the clinic, the supermarket, the school, but also jobs and other economic opportunities. But throughout my studies, I have seen that often this right to walk is compromised for certain user groups, and certainly older adults, who, by the way, I have to say there is a whole discipline, gerontology, that studies older adults, but we have very little in terms of, from the part of designers and urban planners, about spaces for older adults, even though we know that, especially in the global north, our cities are aging, and we have what is called pejoratively sometimes the silver tsunami of people over 65 as the fastest growing group in cities. And in 2017, World Health Organization published a toolkit about age-friendly cities. So this comes from a relatively recent article of mine that was published in the Journal of the American Public Association. There is a ton of literature on the environmental influences on walking, and we know that population and employment density, proximity of destinations, the land use mix, the connectivity of streets all affect walkability. We also know that issues relating to street crime, but also traffic, affect safety. Design items such as urban furniture, but also trees that provide shade, the availability and presence of crosswalks, the presence of destinations affect the comfort and convenience of walking. And there are a number of items that affect streetscape aesthetics, the urban forestry, but also the upkeep of the street and the sidewalk. All these items affect the walkability, safety, comfort, convenience, and aesthetics that also affect the propensity to walk. And we have, as I mentioned, quite a rich literature about these topics. As a background of my study, I also want to show a recent chart that was published by the Administration of Aging in the US in 2022 that shows the increase in number of persons over 65, first, thanks, of course, to modern medicine. Of course, 2040 and 2060 are projections, and we are not exactly sure if these numbers are staying, but I guess the whole purpose of this graph is to show that we have many more people now in our cities who are over 65. And we should start thinking, designing, and planning for them. So my study is an empirical study that focuses on an inner city neighborhood. I mentioned that I'm interested in vulnerable populations. I would say that the people that I have studied in this study are triply vulnerable. They are older, they are low income, and they were all ethnic minority populations. And Westlake is a neighborhood 1.5 miles west of downtown Los Angeles. Very typical inner city neighborhood. What I mean by that, a neighborhood that has experienced disinvestment with almost 95% of the residents being non-white. 39% are below the federal poverty levels. About 10% are over 65. It does have a concentration of senior housing units. 2,274 are senior housing. I looked into the walk score of this neighborhood, and I found that it was 91. And remember this number, and you'll see, I will comment about the accuracy of these numbers later in my presentation, but I guess the number was high because it is a mixed-use neighborhood. It has a variety of destinations. It has high densities. So I did something that it was not original. It was actually, it started in this building by Kevin Lynch and Rifkin in 1959 in a study that was a prelude to the landmark study of Kevin Lynch's, The Image of the City. They took some people, not older adults, they took them around, walk around a block in Boston, and they basically told them, we're about to take a short walk. Please do not look for anything in particular, but tell me about the things you see, hear, or smell, everything and anything you notice. And so I decided to repeat the masters, but I took older adults with my students who lived in this high rise that you see on that block in Westlake. It's called Union Tower. And we took them one by one around their block. And we pretty much asked them to do the same. And after the walk, we sat down and we interviewed them, and we basically asked what things stood out from the walk. How comfortable did you feel during the walk? Do you usually take precautions to walk in your neighborhood? And what would you change if you could? What we saw and heard from them were very surprising to us and painted a very black picture of walking in inner city neighborhoods, especially if you're an older adult. The vast majority of the discussion was about trash. Trash was very visible, to use from Alan Jacobs, the term visual cues. The visual cues, the first visual cue that you see in this neighborhood walking around is trash. The sidewalk is sticky with trash, said someone. It has even dog crap that people do not clean. Sometimes it's hard to make a step because of the trash. The street is full of trash, said someone else, and food waste. I have even witnessed a driver dumping his trash on the street at the stop sign. Another prominent discussion was about the lack of trees. There are no more trees, said someone. There used to be trees. A business owner can say that the tree is impacting his business and call the city to remove it. There are now holes on the sidewalk, you can see it on the lower slide, where trees used to be, and they get filled up with trash. I have to say this is also a security concern for these older adults, because one of the prominent fears is of tripping and falling. And back in the late 90s with my students, we did a studio and we served as project managers for an adjacent inner city neighborhood. We had funding to plant 300 trees. We were only able to plant 100 trees because there is a law in Los Angeles that you really need to get the approval of the landlord to plant a tree. And these are neighborhoods with absentee landlords. Landlords were not there. We could not find them. A few that we found were not interested. So there is a kind of a perennial problem. And also, we know that even if you manage to plant a tree, The average life of a tree in these inner city neighborhoods on the West Coast is 5 years. So you have to water them, which is something that the city is not doing much. A lot of discussion about the cracked and uneven sidewalks. The sidewalks are deteriorated and very uneven, said someone. The cracks make it difficult for me to walk. I have to be always looking down and find a path that is even, so my cart doesn't get stuck. I was talking about the shopping cart. Graffiti and barbed wire fences. People also commented upon that. There is nothing nice to look at along the streets, only graffiti and barbed wire fences. And again, these are from the pictures that we were taking as we were walking around these streets. No benches. I want to take a rest break on this little wall. I was showing a wall. You see, there is nowhere for me to sit and take a rest. We saw someone using their own seats to rest. I often have to walk a shorter route because of lack of places to rest. Having some benches would have been useful. And there are no bus shelters. And we're talking now about neighborhoods that the majority of the years are pretty hot. I mean, these are areas that in Los Angeles that often have temperatures over 90s and sometimes over 100s. This is from a very recent article in the adjacent Koreatown neighborhood, because I'm giving you all these to show that I didn't choose the most horrible neighborhood. Westlake is a very typical inner city neighborhood in Los Angeles. So there was a very recent article, beginning of this month in Los Angeles Times. It's called, "In Koreatown, a lack of bus shelters makes a hot summer even hotter," and was showing these three ladies in their 80s waiting for the bus on August 16th, standing in the shade of a fence near the bus stop because there is no shade over the bus stop and there is no bus shelter. And there was a lot of discussion about the traffic impediments. Now, these are, I believe, Gary talked about the legacy streets. These were the first streetcar suburbs, Pico Boulevard in Los Angeles, very near this neighborhood. These remain the streets where we have the major transit arteries in the city. They have been widened and widened. They're very wide at this point. They have short traffic signal walks. And actually, in the interviews after the walks, the vast majority of the people said that the most stressful part of the walk was that they were in the middle of the block and the traffic light turns red and people start honking. There is fast moving traffic. They talked about reckless drivers and about impatient drivers that curse and honk. And here are some quotes. "I need to hustle across the street because there isn't enough time to cross before the light turns red. I don't feel safe crossing at either crosswalk. I walk slowly," said someone else, "and the light changes so quickly when I'm in the middle of the street." And they talked about social impediments. I would say that the physical impediments and traffic impediments probably dominated the conversation, but they also talked about drunk people. And we found quite a lot of visual cues of empty beer cans and empty alcohol bottles. A lot of people experiencing homelessness, and some of the older adults said that sometimes they have to walk over or around someone or walk on the street so that they're not going to go over someone who is sleeping. But they even saw images and mentioned about people peeing on sidewalks and about gang activity. There are a lot of people drinking and doing drugs in the streets. Being here makes me nervous. This person actually said that he preferred to walk on the corridors of his building, the inside corridors, in order to exercise and walk, because walking on the street was so scary for him. "I feel unsafe waiting for the bus with all these drunk people around." And I have to say that also that why is this important? Because these people did not own a car. A lot of older adults, even if they have a car, they cannot drive a car anymore people in their 80s and in their 90s. People live longer and want to be active. And so walking is the prominent mode of transportation, or taking the bus, okay? I feel unsafe waiting for the bus with all these drunk people around. So this is a word cloud. Trash was the most commonly mentioned word, but also the lack of shade, the cracked sidewalks, the lack of trees, beer cans, smells. So how do we respond? I mean, how do we create age-friendly streets? It is not rocket science. People want comfort. They want street trees and other shading structures, awnings. That's why I talked to you about awnings in particular, trellises, bus shelters, street and bus stop benches, and other opportunities for seating that I will talk about in the next slide, and cool pavements that I'm going to talk in the slide after next. So, of course, we want more benches, but there are also opportunities, and cities have started experimenting. A number of cities converted unused parking spots, and we know American cities have too many parking spots into parklets. On the left, you see a parklet in San Francisco, but also inner cities are full with empty, underutilized lots because we've had all this investment. They can be easily converted into mini parks. On the right, you see the Golden Age Park. My research team and I really worked with older adults in a nearby senior citizen center. We did focus groups, we compiled design guidelines for building age-friendly parks. And then we collaborated with a nonprofit, the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust. They got some help from the county. They bought this 1/3 of an acre lot. They converted it to what is the first age-friendly park in Los Angeles, possibly the first age-friendly park in the US, even though they're quite common in East Asia and parts of Europe, like in Spain and Scandinavia. Why is this age-friendly? First of all, it pretty much followed what the older adults were saying. They wanted a small private space that they could enter and use on their way to different activities. It has low impact exercise machines. They have a priority to use these machines. It even has gardening plots that they're elevated and they don't have to bow down, which is difficult on their knees and on their backs. So we can see more of these if cities put the effort and the money, and if nonprofit groups support these. Cool pavements. There has been a pilot program in the city of Los Angeles. Technology may come to the rescue for very hot climates. These cool pavements absorb less sunlight than asphalt pavements, which make surface feel cooler. And if implemented over large surfaces, cooler surface temperatures can decrease air temperatures. I have a colleague of mine, Kelly Turner, that she really evaluates some of the outcomes of these programs. On warm summer afternoons, the cool pavement surface is 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than nearby black asphalt. Age-friendly streets should promote instead of hinder mobility. We need some wider sidewalks. It does require some political will, because the first thing that some neighborhoods would do is to protest if you narrow the streets. Sidewalk maintenance and upkeep, I think everybody would want that. And curb ramps, and even if ADA is mandating them, I was quite amazed to see how many blocks in inner cities do not have them. Safety is a primary concern for everyone. It is the first item on the mind of older adults, especially tripping and falling. So they require better upkeep and maintenance of crosswalks and sidewalks, even smooth and non-slippery paving surfaces. Rubber pavements are excellent. Traffic hazards, we have 40 years or so literature on traffic calming. A more recent issue has to do with scooters. I think someone else mentioned. We also have cyclists on the sidewalks. So cities have really to see the separation of scooters and cyclists from sidewalks, and maybe trying to identify pathways for them. And of course, crime is a much more structural issue, not much you can do through design, even though there is a whole, again, crime through environmental design. Lighting certainly helps make people feel safer. The silver lining of the pandemic was the slow streets or open streets that have been called in some areas. This is from a recent article in the San Francisco Chronicle. I'm a senior with mobility limitations. San Francisco slow streets have been a godsend. There are some equity issues. One of my students in a capstone project found that they were much likely wealthier neighborhoods to have designated slow streets than poor neighborhoods. So quoting from our book, justice in cities is intrinsically linked to their physical environments, but the concept of justice is too rarely an explicit concern in urban design discourse and design practice. I truly hope this will start changing. In conclusion, my first conclusion actually I haven't written, but I want to come back to the walkability score. And I want to say that this methodology of Kevin Lynch gave us so much more accurate images and account of the actual state of the sidewalks through the eyes of the older adult than an artificial walkability score that relies often on certain easy to get data from the census. It puts up a number. But some of the other conclusions is that the urban ground floor, and I think everybody would agree on that, is an essential part of a city's public realm. The sidewalks are ubiquitous public spaces and should attract the attention of urban designers and planners. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but way too often urban designers are much more interested in flashier projects than the urban ground floors. The urban ground floor is particularly important for lower income, older adults in inner city neighborhoods because they don't have many other alternatives for public space. Designing urban ground floors that are inclusive of older adults would bolster their right to the city. And a series of physical improvements, I try to show they're simple, can make urban ground floors more inclusive and hospitable to older adults, and they would be also more enjoyable to a broader public. That little park that I've mentioned is not excluding other ages. So you find mothers with kids coming in there to get a little bit of a respite from the very tough sidewalks. Design interventions cannot address all impediments that older adults and other people in the inner cities are facing, which require much larger and much needed political and financial commitments from the parts of the city. But still, age-friendly design can add comfort, can reduce fear, and can bolster justice in cities. Thank you very much.
Take a couple of questions. Yes. Thank you. I find your presentation very inspiring. So in one of your slides, you mentioned that the walk score of Westlake is 91, I think, which seems like irony to us after all your study. So I was wondering, do you think it's still worth fixing the walk score or all the other like walking score systems in the US?
That's a good question. If you can make it more accurate, but that requires much more than really looking into census data. And it requires more resources. So if there is a way to see things, to incorporate issues, and these are easily available data about crime and about safety, but there are also other issues that may be more difficult, such as the trash on the streets, or how even or uneven the sidewalk is, that very much affect walkability. So in the end, if you cannot incorporate these issues that affect walking, it is, I think, more damaging than accurate. And actually, before I gave this presentation, I double-checked, because I had checked that score 2 years ago when I was writing this, and it was 93. It is 91. I mean, it went a little bit down, but that's not much. And I know that the real estate industry is using the score very much, but it's a completely useless score from in the eyes of these older people that participated in this study.
Old school method. Yeah, I was saying the old school method. I really like that. And quite straightforward. I just wonder in terms of the ground floor spaces. I mean, there's so much elements around the design, in a way, start to determine the things, right? But there's another element in terms of relation to older adults. They're how much they feel the city product. There's large elements in terms of how people own those ground floor spaces or operate in this contract. Perceived that's the older adults often streets or consumers. In my data, I'm surprisingly with in Sweden, the data had about this it's often they were often perceived as not very welcome because they're not.
Yes. I think that's a correct. A lot of the private spaces, you need to consume something in order to be welcome. And so if you do not consume, even if there might be seating within a private bar or cafe or whatever, you have to sit down and pay something in order to sit. And when we're talking about the right to the city and the right to walking, you shouldn't have to do that, right? But having said that, there was a positive comment of someone who said that, thank God to so-and-so who lets me rest without saying anything. So at some point we find also humanity emerging and some people welcoming other people. But the vast majority of the cases, a lot of these spaces, there is a very concrete division between the public and the private realm. And if you sit in the private realm, you have to pay for it.
Yes, thank you very much for the subject itself. But you develop mostly the problem of mobility, more comfort in the public spaces. The definition of urban ground floor match to these public spaces. But I think, especially for the elder people, the idea of Rez de Ville, so I'm changing, the idea of Rez de Ville has great interest for solving and helping the elder people. For instance, in Paris now, you all the mainly the wealth services, and there is a lot of services, doctors,
Yes.
So on and so on. They are on the ground floor of the building.
Yes.
And if the elder live on the ground floor, of course, it's very, very much easier for them. And if also we are interested by the court where they can stay, so this is why if you stay just in the public, private, you miss a thing where you can have interactive and a much larger point of view as a Rez de Ville than just make more comfort, which is very obvious. I mean, when you see the sidewalk, I mean,
I fully agree with you, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity to really think age-friendly city about all these services. But at the end of the day, people have to walk to these services. They would not. Some of them may live on the same building, and but and I run into this with parks. This neighborhood has some parks. It was not a matter of not having parks, but you don't find all the people in the parks. And when we had these focus groups about why are you not in the park, it was not so much, it was how do I go there? How do I walk? They walk from my home to the park. It's really bad. So in order to all these, I agree with you, are interconnected, but you have to think about how you also bring people to these services. And if the public realm of mobility is failing you, it is much more difficult to bring people to the services that you're talking about, which I agree, it's a good step forward.
Yeah, sorry, two very quick points. One, just a clarification. I've just checked my slides. The awning, the problem in my speech wasn't the awning itself. It was the unfavorable type was an awning with a wall as well. So the awning was within the private space, and then the wall on the outside.
Okay.
So there were some good awning ones and some not so good, and also the favorability thing depends on what the purpose is. So if the purpose is outdoor activity and walking, then that was considered less favorable. If the purpose was security,
Seating,
it might be favorable.
Okay.
My question, it's partly to you, but also it relates to some other thing. I was interested in you to mention the dearth of trees and where trees used to be.
Yes.
And I think Gary Hack also earlier mentioned like the history of the local, what shops used to be there. And something like that. And I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago where someone was talking about place attachment, and I can talk about this privately later if there's interest, to do with what had been lost from an area. And it's just, I'm just trying to connect these things up. There's something, I think there's something very interesting about this idea of what's valued as well, which also relates to one of the other speeches about, like, what do people value and whose voice is heard, because it's like who values those trees, and where and who decides that their value of having the tree is worth more than the business owner who wants the tree removed. So maybe
that's I think the $1 million question. That's really a very good question, and so far, at least, I think the policy in Los Angeles is not a fair one, because it gives priority completely to landlords. And so all these neighborhoods that are extremely high renter occupied, people have no say, and these are the people who live in the neighborhoods. But it basically says that you really, in order to plant a tree in front of someone's property, and we're not talking about within their property line, we're talking about outside the property line, you have to have the consensus of the owner, and the owner, even in inner cities, they have to say, and that's even worse in my case, they have to say that they will water it. So that it gives the responsibility of the watering and the maintenance of the tree to the owner. And so, of course, the owners are going to say no. And we also had cases of merchants deciding to cut trees because their signs are hidden because of the trees. So there are a number of issues about trees. There are also, earlier on in the book on sidewalks, I looked into conflicts, because sometimes, depending on the street tree, they attend the roots and you have cracked sidewalks. So there are a lot of issues. I mean, cities have to really identify the species that do not do that do not require excess water and all that. But in my view, trees are a public good, because especially for very warm climates like the west of the United States, they're needed. But interestingly, I was looking into Gary's slide and I saw your two pictures, and the later one had trees, while the earlier one did not.
It's interesting also in light of Peter's presentations that necessity to ask for permission does not seem to extend to street parking or traffic solutions,
Exactly.
but it does to trees.